The topic of our discussion today is poverty, globalization, faith traditions, and poverty alleviation. We've traveled kind of a long way in this course, right? Let me sketch what we've covered, right? From the very beginning, a few remarks about pluralism and exclusivism, right? Remember those those comments at the very, very beginning? And maybe I hope that as the class has progressed, their significance have become more apparent to you. And then last time we kind of picked up again on that discussion with Tony Blair present. And it continues to be, I think, a very important issue for us. Sketching first the world of faiths, especially the discussion of secularization versus desecularization, and maybe bit dipping in what we did in this first full session is just to understand what's happening in terms of the developments of faith. And then next session was about globalization, and then ambivalence, ambiguity of globalization, having this shadow side as well as what is normally celebrated, a positive side in terms of both fostering economic prosperity, cultural interchange, a whole host of things, but nonetheless, and registering very significant downsides. Of course, there are discussions, and they bear on our conversations today, whether in fact the poverty that we see, to what extent it is caused by globalization processes, and to what extent we need to rethink not just, some people would say, not just how globalization is being conducted, quote unquote, but whether globalization as such, whether the system of which globalization is part is indeed viable system for the planet and for the peoples. We haven't quite asked that radical question, but that radical question is there in the air, right? With the critics of globalization processes, with the critics of how things are being done normally. And I think it's important at least to keep in mind that there's also this side of the discussion. We've talked then quite a bit about economic side of globalization, both in terms of overarching framework for economic activity, markets and values that shape market, as well as then paying attention to what happens at the level of individual corporation. Sessions then on reconciliation and interfaith dialogue, and then now return back to the question of economy from certain different angle, namely the question of poverty. That's common interest, I think, between faith traditions, and I think proponents of globalization, is somehow to improve the lot of the poor. Faiths, I think most faiths, there is a deep and abiding commitment to the poor. If you take Christian scripture, the same is true of Quran, other scriptures as well, sacred books as well. A kind of strong sense that those who, as it says in the good book, grind the face of the poor, right, ought to be resisted, and ought to be resisted in a strenuous way. And there is this extraordinary vision, right, of everyone sitting under their fig tree, everyone having their own sphere which they can control and command, which is a source of well-being for them. But also, I think religious faiths have a history of betrayal of the poor. Certainly that's the case with the Christian tradition, where interest was not directed toward them, where a religion aligns itself with the interests of power and forgets about some of the most basic commitments that religious traditions have. Now, if you shift and look at globalization and effects of globalization, there too, there's a promise that the lot of the poor will be improved. And indeed, there's a claim being made that this is the best way in order to alleviate poverty in the world today. And yet also there is this trail, I think, of blood and tears. There are those whose lot has not been improved. There are those whose lot has become worse as a result of globalization, partly because of displacement, mainly because of the tremendous and rapid changes that are happening in the world today on account of globalization. So de facto, many are still left in poverty. And I think that maybe we can say, at least that's what I would like to argue, that one of the basic tests, both for faiths and for globalization, is, well, how are we able to help those who are the weakest? In Christianity, the final judgment is based on the treatment of the poor. Some of you who know those texts in Matthew 25, when the nations come together before the judge, then the judge will say, I was sick, I was imprisoned, I was hungry. You did not come to my aid, you did not visit me, you did not give me food. And he will say to you, go to my other side, right? I think increasingly people are also aware more broadly that the test for efficacy of globalization itself, we have to think of it also in terms of, and maybe primarily in terms of, effects on the people who are the weakest of all. I would want to suggest that the test of the humanity of any system or of any society is how it treats its weakest members. Whether we are really interested in humanity, right, in the humanum, is how you treat those who can fend for themselves, those whose interests do not necessarily in any way are intertwined with yours, those who you could afford to leave by the wayside. Humanity is tested of a society, of a system, how it treats folks of this sort. And I think in terms of faiths and globalization processes, and especially economic aspect of globalization, they may be kind of a mutual learning process. I know that often when it comes especially to this issue, there's a strong conflict, right? Faith traditions, many in the faith traditions have felt need to protest against how globalization is run. And the same might be in a different way true of folks who sit in some of the great institutions of globalization like World Bank, right? What do religions have to do with this whole thing except to muddle your thinking about what you should do in order to alleviate the lot of the poor, right? But maybe faiths can learn something from economists, and faith traditions, I think, have traditionally expressed concern for the poor by insisting on equitable, just distribution. But faiths have not worried too much about creation of wealth or examining the causes of the poverty. It's almost like an assumption wealth is simply there to be plucked as a ripe fruit from trees around, right? But you got to make it somehow, right? And faiths haven't much engaged this process, or at least recognized that that's what needs to happen so that you have something to distribute. So time might be for faiths to learn that you can distribute what you don't have, and that what you distribute may be of little effect if you haven't attended to, at least in some way, to the causes of poverty. Maybe global economic leaders can learn from faith traditions as well, that simple stress on economic growth might not have the expected effect on the poor, especially maybe if faith traditions are taken seriously and if effects then of the economic systems are measured by, or viability or desirability of an economic systems are measured by the effects that they have on those who are the weakest. Few more comments, and they concern now definitions of wealth and poverty. What is wealth and poverty? And when I think about this, I'm always reminded of this fine book that isn't read these days very much, but when I was about your age, maybe a little bit older, came out, which I thought was absolutely splendid book, and was a book by Erich Fromm. Heard of Erich Fromm? To Be and to Have. Right? And basically it's a book, it's a book worth reading, or Google it and get the basic gist of the thing, and then you see whether, based on the Google Cliff Notes, you might want to read it, and I suggest that you do. he distinguished between these two basic modes in which human beings exist, a mode of being and mode of having. Mode of having, is a kind of mode of life marked by desire for acquisition, for consumption, for possession of things. And the mode of being is marked by generative action in the world, and by experiencing the world, and by living authentically oneself. Right? That's a kind of rough sketch of these two modes. And then you can think of wealth and poverty in both of these modes, and it looks very different if you look at it in those two modes. If you look at wealth in the having mode, well, then it looks like the stuff of various kinds. Some stuff is very tangible, some stuff is kind of ethereal, but nonetheless you can describe it as stuff that one obtains to consume or to control. And the question then becomes whether up above certain threshold that's necessary for survival, even in the mode of having, is what's considered wealth simply a matter of stuff. I would want to suggest that even in the mode of having, wealth is not simply stuff, but wealth is concerned with psychological attitudes as well as social relations. Something is considered wealth in the context of certain social relations and not abstractly in and of itself. Let me give you an example. You take, for instance, a gift. Take something as a gift. Now you walk through on the street and you see a gift shop, right? And what is sitting in the gift shop are all gifts, are they? There's stuff, right? They're not gifts. There's stuff that when you buy it with certain intention to give something to somebody else becomes a gift. But it's not a gift as a thing in itself, right? It is a gift when it enters into this exchange between people, that one person buys something to give to something else. Now it's a gift. Before, it was a thing sitting on the shelf. Now, I think that something is similar is true of wealth as well. It's not simply stuff. I think it's also social relations. What is considered poor or wealthy depends not on amount of stuff. Robinson Crusoe alone on an island, is he wealthy or not? I don't know, right? Or Marx gives a typical example, right, of relative character of wealth, and if the character of wealth is relative, then it means that wealth is a social relations, right? A guy has a home, very nice little 2-bedroom cottage, and next to him somebody builds a mansion. And suddenly what was very fine house, right, turns into a shack overnight because there is a comparative relationship between these two. I think it's important that at the level even of having, we think of wealth not simply as amount and quality of stuff, but as a social relation. Now, let's go into wealth and poverty in the being mode. You know, in terms of possessions, you can be rich. Indeed, you can be the richest person in the world and still be poor. You can call it as a never enough person. You've encountered folks like that, right? It's kind of you're never enough, no matter what you do. Some of us have parents who are like that, right? In regard to our achievements, they're kind of never enough folks. No matter what you do, it's not quite right. You've got to achieve certain higher goal than that, right? And organize the whole life in terms of then amassing, and then you never quite have enough. I think anthropologically, that's rooted in human finitude. We are finite beings, right? We are needy beings. And without satisfying these needs, without us not having enough somehow, right? We always do not have enough because we need to have more things in order to continue to live. But I think it's fundamentally rooted in our self-transcendence. Because you are always beyond anything that you have actually reached, right? You can always imagine yourself a step ahead. And you're always, in a sense, stretched. So your feet are on the ground, but your arm is somehow reaching somewhere beyond where you are and into the stars, right? So that's the self-transcendence of human beings. That's where this permanent, if you want to say, dissatisfaction, never enough, is rooted. But it's strengthened, I think, culturally for us, strengthened by these comparisons to which we always make, and it's strengthened in particular, I think, in the market economies, because market economies are predicated not just on satisfaction of desires, right, but on generation of desire yet to be satisfied. That's how the thing functions, and sometimes that's a very good thing, right? Because that's how progress happens. That's how we have iPhones and things of that sort, right? Which, but that's also how the whole way of existing as permanently being dissatisfied as a condition of possibility of advancement happens. And it's a question: what do we do with this? At the anthropological level, bracket your anthropological experience, you think of it economically, and you think, of course, you've got to generate those needs, right? And you got to motivate people to satisfy those needs, then the economy is moving. Think of it in terms of one's own experience of the self, of being in the self, being with others. And then I think things somewhat shift, right? And one experiences it maybe in a different way. So you can be a richest person in the world and be never enough person. You can be poor, really poor, I mean. And unless you are starving, don't have clean water or adequate shelter, you can be more than enough person. Life then has been organized maybe around generative acting and proper enjoyment. The happiest person that I've ever encountered, I think I talked about her in this class, was my nanny. She had nothing, absolutely nothing. Lost her husband in World War II, did not have a place to live, came to our family because we had 3 rooms and she had none. And I still, to this day, have not met a person who was more genuinely satisfied than she was. And she was, in a funny way, enjoying life, right? As I mentioned before, she was singing all the time. Right? Very poor, but kind of more than enough person. It's rooted maybe in generative acting. All other things being equal, are you richer when you have helped dig a well in an African village, or when you have acquired a new iPad? Or, say, enjoyment. All other things being equal, are you richer when you have understood Plato's Euthyphro, or when you have acquired $1,000? Ooh, I don't know about that one. Euthyphro and $1,000, right? Okay. Give me an example. You know what I mean. So I think it's important for us to think about what wealth actually means and how to understand wealth. And indeed, I think that one of the great issues before us is to reflect on the character of wealth and character of poverty. So, and especially since if it's true that economy is the driver of globalization processes. And if it's true also, and some of you may doubt that, right, that the really big important questions in life are questions of what this whole thing that we are engaged in is for. Footnote into these comments. 3 days ago, I was sitting here, and we had a conference of Jewish and Christian thinkers, or theologians, rabbis, whatever. There was a working group of us. And we were presenting our results of our work. And I wrote a paper on human flourishing in kind of Christian, Jewish, and on the side also Muslim traditions. There was a friend of mine who did the same thing also, and law professor Tony Kronman was responding to us, right? And you can see why we chose Tony Kronman, right? Because he's interested in the questions of large questions of the meaning of life and how they bear upon on our lives. And we were sitting there, and after we've finished this discussion, then he leans to me and said, Miroslav, when I say to some of my friends that these questions of metaphysical questions that we were discussing, the questions of moral order, of the way to understand self and relations, human relations, the good, what is the good that we are pursuing? When I say to my friends, some of my friends, that these are more important questions, more crucial for us than how to fight terrorism, and you can go down the line, they laugh at me. But it's maybe important to stop and pause and ask the question whether indeed the large question, how should we then live, is a fundamental question that we need to be asking. Certainly, they have consequences for how we understand the bearing of wealth on happiness. You remember that we had this discussion, Tony and I here, after we read this controversial claim that there was no improvement in happiness from Stone Age to to today, right? It may be debated, and Tony was responding, and none of us wants to return, and that's true. But what does that prove, right? Except that we may be mistaken about what truly satisfies, right? Maybe that's the lesson from this, and maybe that's in a sense, the difficulty, the bind that we find ourselves in. Obviously, I don't want to go back, right? So don't misunderstand me. I'm not advocating going back, but is it possible to ask the question in a different way and to reorient ourselves away from stress on kind of acquiring the means of living instead of living, from having to being? I think that's the large question that the faith traditions pose. And I think that's also maybe a large question that surfaces for us in the context of the crisis in which we find ourselves today.